Tutuzile Zuma Sambudla's post on Twitter, now X, is alleged to have played a role in the July 2021 riots in KwaZulu-Natal as well as Gauteng in her incitement to commit public violence. Court hearings, a cybercrime expert said the tweets helped rally sympathy for former President Jacob Zuma and warned of potential violence if he was imprisoned. Some of her social media posts were deleted. In our conversation with the managing director of SourceWorks, Masande Jasi, let's try to find out about posts, the pros and cons of using social media. Masande, thank you very much for joining us this morning on SABC. We do appreciate your time. I mean, I think I've worked in the courts long enough to understand that whether you post and delete at a much later stage, it's still retrievable.
That is indeed a fact. And the reason for that is that this information is delivered through servers or social media platforms. And those servers store information on hard drives, much like we do on our laptops. So when you delete a post or any public-facing content, it's not necessarily deleted more than that you cannot see it anymore, and maybe the public either. This evidence or information is then stored for, varying amounts of time on these servers for various reasons. Reasons such as the need to retain that information for use and analysis by the social media platform, or the need for making it available to law enforcement should the need arise for any valid reason.
Yeah, but Lloyd, sorry, please go ahead.
So this information will not necessarily be made available to anyone per se. There are processes to follow in that regard, legal processes to retrieve information.
Yeah, but there are pros and cons to that because the information is also kept for a certain amount of time. So we've often heard when this information needs to be shared with law enforcement agencies, a certain time frame need not lapse. If you want to have access to that information. This would include something like cell phone records, for example.
Yes.
In this instance, we're talking about social media.
That's correct. So that time period is not prescribed per se by the platform itself. It depends on the legal jurisdiction of the areas where this data is stored. So in South Africa, for example, if Twitter has data centers here where they store information, they might be required to store information, let's say, literally for 5 days, whereas in another region, it might be for 5 years. So that also has a bearing on whether this information can be retrieved, essentially. Yeah. On top of the fact that it costs money to store information.
That's right.
Because it's stored on, hard drives, which are bought, maintained, and need to be recycled as necessary.
But I guess then what one needs to do is to have an entire conversation about social media etiquette, because posting and then deleting at a later stage when you've come to your senses really is not going to help you. So I guess I don't see much about social media etiquette. It almost feels like social media is a place where are you duped into just putting out whatever you want? Is there enough that is being said about social media etiquette and the understanding of exactly what you spoke about, that whatever you put there sticks?
Yes. So I wouldn't say it's likely a matter of people being duped more than, it's things that people do in the heat of a moment, things that they feel need to be said in the heat of the moment. And maybe they realize afterwards that, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I think what's important to note for everyone is that having content on internet platforms is almost like having a tattoo. Even while you can remove it, it doesn't completely go away. I think there is an awareness that people should have about that. Because even in instances where this information might have been deleted or lost by Twitter itself, there are other platforms that still retain this information. There are market analysis platforms that crawl the internet and gather information for analysis. There are others that archive information for reference later. So I think people need to be aware of that.
Yeah, and like you indicated, it's not just anyone who could have access to that. It's in cases where law enforcement agencies would want to investigate a particular matter. That is only when your information does become available to a third party. But let's talk about that. You know, if not law enforcement agencies, how do I know that my information is safe and secure? Almost everywhere you go these days, you have to fill in something very personal about your details. If you're logging on, you have to put on some personal details, whether it's your identity number, whether you're at a clothing store and you want to open an account, you'll be asked for your ID number. All these are personal details that are stored somewhere in the internet, somewhere on a computer. And should we be feeling safe about our information, or what can we do to keep it safe or limit what it is that we put out in the digital sphere, if I can?
Digital universe. So I think in South Africa in particular, you know, we're in a much better place than we were 15 years ago as far as how private information is handled. There are regulations such as the POPI Act that stipulates how information should be handled and who should process information, and that we actually have the right to query those that handle our information about how secure it is, and they should then produce reports to say, this is how it's stored, and this is how it's accessed, and this is how long it will be on our platform. We do have, you know, the ability to query that. But while it is there, for compliant organizations such as financial service who have to comply with such regulations, this information is handled very strictly, to the extent that should anyone who should not have access to the information, you know, flags are sent off. Also, there's always logs about who accessed the information when, and if it was undue access, you know, there are serious ramifications for such breaches in organizations. So we are in a much better space, but we should always endeavor to push companies that are not compliant to prove, you know, that they are working towards it. There's also the Information Regulator of South Africa that's been put in place, whose role is to oversee that this is done. And there are harsh penalties, you know, for breaches, as we've seen in the media, I would say, in the past few years.
Masande, thank you very much indeed. I think you touched on the most critical parts of what we needed to have this discussion on, in terms of people being very careful about what they post on social media. And it can be retrieved. We've seen certain instances, a number of instances, in fact, in the media over recent days that will tell you if you put something on social media, even if you delete it, it's able to be retrieved. In particular, in cases where law enforcement agencies would want to retrieve that information to investigate something. Not anyone can just go and retrieve your information. All right, Masande, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on the program.